This is such a fun tutorial and I can't wait to share with you the process about how I created a buffalo plaid check design with timber stains. I picked up this cute little table from the op shop for $35 and I probably overpaid for it because it is actually a veneer top on this table. However, I thought it was such a cute design and I couldn't walk out without it. Because it was so small in size, I knew that I wanted to do something a little bit unique with it to really make it pop and stand out. To start off with, I wanted to sand off all the varnish on the top of the table. As I mentioned, because this was a veneer, I had to be a little bit more careful when I was sanding it back because I didn't want to burn through the veneer surface. This meant I had to be a little bit more cautious with what sandpaper I was using, and I started off with a 120 grit instead of an 80 grit, which is what I would usually start off with. I sanded all of the varnish off with the 120 grit, which took a little bit longer, and then I swapped to a 240 grit to really smooth out this surface. Once I was happy with the top, I then moved on to the edge and I sanded off the varnish around the edge of the table, which actually revealed a chipboard underneath. Now, as I was going to be keeping the top raw and exposed, I didn't really mind this too much. It was just going to give a little bit more character to the piece. However, if you had an issue with this, you could add a veneer strip around the edge of the table if you wanted to. Now that the timber surface on top was all sanded back to raw, I needed to give the rest of the piece a scuff sand. I'm going to be painting the body of the piece and these legs, and so I've grabbed out a piece of 120 grit sandpaper and I'm just going to use that with my hand to scuff sand all of the surfaces. If you're just new to upcycling and refinishing, you might not know too much about scuff sanding, and so the reason why you need to give a scuff sand to the rest of the piece before painting it is because the old varnish is quite sleek and that is making a hard surface for any paint to stick to, and the scuff sand roughs up that surface, which gives a nice surface for the paint to then grip to. And of course, once you finish your scuff sand, you do need to go through and give the piece a really good clean. I'm using my crud cutter degreaser to just go through over the whole piece and make sure that there is no grime or dust on it before I can start painting. Now I'm going to apply some masking tape to the top of the table because I want to keep the top of the table all this raw timber. I'm going to be just spray painting with cans of spray paint the bottom of this, as that's going to be the quickest way to get this project done, and I want to make sure none of that spray paint gets onto this timber surface. We're actually going to be using quite a lot of masking tape for this project, and so I highly recommend you get a good quality masking tape. Frog tape is definitely what I like to use, but if you don't have access to frog tape, just pick a really good high quality masking tape. Now I'm going to apply a primer to the base of the table. I'm using a primer that's called Zinser Bin Primer, and I don't actually need this primer for its stain blocking properties on this project because I'm going to be painting the base black. If I was going to be painting in a lighter color, I would definitely need to use this Zinser Bin primer for its stain blocking properties, but I also like it because it is a really great adhesion primer and a little bit stronger than some of the water-based primers, and that's why I decided to still use it on this project. After allowing the primer to completely dry, I then grabbed out a 240 grit sandpaper and just gave a little bit of a scuff sand to all the areas that had been primed. Now it's time to apply the black spray paint. You can do this with a spray can, or if you've got some black paint on hand, you can just use a paintbrush and paint the base of this. I just chose to use a spray paint to make it faster for myself, and I used an oil-based enamel spray paint. Depending on the brand of paint you use, you may find you can get away with one coat, or you may need to do 2 coats of this paint. Once you're happy with the base and it's all been completely painted, you can remove the masking tape around the timber edge. Now it's time for the fun part, to create our buffalo plaid pattern. You need to grab out your masking tape and place down one strip of the masking tape at the top of the piece of furniture. Then you're going to grab out another strip of masking tape which you're going to use as your spacer. You're going to place the spacer down, add another strip of masking tape below that, then remove your spacer and add it down below the second line that you've just added. Then you're going to repeat the process over and over again, moving your spacers down as you go, then adding another strip of masking tape. You might find that if the width of the item that you are going to be creating the pattern on is getting wider as you go, you may need to have an extra couple of pieces of spacer, because you want to have the spacer as much as possible covering the space, because you might find that if you only use a little piece of masking tape as the spacer in the middle, that the two edges end up at different levels. Once you've finished applying the first row of tape, it is then time to apply your first color of stain. Now the first color that you choose, you want it to be your lightest of the three colors. You're going to have 3 different colors of stain in order to create this buffalo plaid, and you want to make sure that the first one you use is the lightest of those 3. When you're applying timber stain, the point of the timber stain is actually to absorb into the timber. So what you want to do is only apply a really light coat of the timber stain, and I am applying it with a sponge here to try and make sure that it's not going to push through under the tape and that I don't end up with a whole lot of bleed through. When you're applying the stain, just remember that multiple thin coats is going to be much better than one thick coat. You're then just going to work your way through and apply the timber stain so that you've got one coat or possibly 2 thin coats over all of these first few lines. And then once you're satisfied that you've got timber stain on all of those first few lines and that you're happy with the colour, you can remove the masking tape and reveal that first strip as part of your buffalo plaid. If you did happen to get a fair bit of bleed through, you could at this point go back with some hand sandpaper and sand off any bleed through before you start applying the tape for the second round of stain. Once you are ready to go with the second round of tape and stain, you're going to need to apply the tape in the opposite direction. What this means here is you're going to then also apply it in the opposite pattern, and the first line needs to be a spacer, and then your second line down is going to be a solid tape, and then your spacer, and so forth, and you're going to keep applying this over the entire table the opposite direction to what you just did. Now, because our stain is getting darker and it's going to be more obvious if we have any bleed through, what I'm using here is a razor blade, and I'm just going along and scouring all along the tape lines to create a break in the timber grains that's going to help stop some of the bleed through from traveling underneath the tape. If you are overly concerned about bleed through, you could also do this on your first round if you wanted to. Now it was time to apply the second color of timber stain. I chose to apply the second colour of timber stain with a rag just to make sure I didn't end up with too much stain on the sponge. As I mentioned before, you want the second colour of timber stain to be darker than the first colour, but not quite as dark as your third colour. So you need to pick out 3 different colours of timber stain in varying levels of colour. For my project, the 3 colours of timber stain that I'm using are called Old Baltic, Teak and Black, and these are all Feast & Watson stains. All of the products I've used in this makeover are linked down in the description so that it's really easy for you to find them and copy along if you want to. Just keep working your way through all of this second colour, making sure not to put too much stain on, but making sure that you do have all of those lines filled. Now it's time for the third round of tape. For this round of tape, you're basically going to repeat the process and put the tape exactly where you did the first time around. However, you're not going to remove the second round of tape. Make sure you leave that second round of tape on, and then you're going to place the third round of tape over the top of this once the stain has dried. Start with your solid line of tape first, and then your spacer, and then work your way through the entire table or surface that you're working with, going tape, spacer, all the way to the other end. You're going to end up with this really fun pattern of little squares. Now this next part was fairly time consuming. What you want to do is take your razor blade and go along in all of these little squares and then just cut that little line in the timber to try and stop the bleed through of this final colour. Now go ahead and apply your final colour of timber stain. I chose to use a black because I wanted to have the most dramatic impact that I could. I used the rag and just dabbed a little bit of timber stain into all of these little squares until I had completed all of them. Now it's time for the super fun part, peeling off the tape. I find that whenever I use masking tape on a project, it's immensely satisfying to peel off the tape and reveal the finished result underneath. You're going to have a fair bit of tape to reveal in the 2 different directions, so peel all the tape off in one direction first and then all of the tape in the opposite direction second. Now you're starting to see how amazing it looks. But we're not quite finished yet, because this is going to be a side table and it's going to be used as a drinks table. We need to make sure we put a heavy duty top coat on. I wanted to use a top coat that was oil based and very durable, but I didn't want to have a really high gloss finish. So I chose a matte finish top coat and then painted the first coat on. You'll find that when you use a matte finish, it is a little bit thinner and you may need to have a couple of extra coats to achieve the desired results. I applied the top coat to the entire top of the table, but then also to the sides of the table because I wanted to seal this timber on the edge. Because the table is chipboard underneath, it does have a really rustic feel, leaving this chipboard exposed on the edge. I then went through and applied a second coat of my top coat everywhere on the top of this table and also on the sides of the table. Now it's finished and it looks absolutely spectacular. The buffalo plaid check pattern creates a real statement and really draws your eye to this table in the room. The table has been transformed from a once discarded $35 op shop find into a one-of-a-kind statement piece. What do you think of the end result? If you loved this buffalo plaid check table makeover, I think this next makeover where I use half round dowels to transform a dresser will be of interest to you too.